Sometimes the hardest thing a father can face isn't death or danger, it's the weight of words he never said. For 20 years, Caleb Boone has lived alone in the Montana wilderness, carrying regrets heavier than any pack he's shouldered through these mountains. The grizzled former cavalry scout thought he'd made peace with his choices, living off the land in his worn cabin where silence was his only companion. Then one morning, a wild German shepherd appeared at the edge of his clearing. The dog didn't want food or shelter, it just watched him with knowing eyes, following him day after day from a careful distance. Caleb tried to ignore the animal, but something about its behavior stirred memories he'd buried deep. This wasn't a lost dog, it had purpose. And slowly, painfully, Caleb began to realize that purpose was connected to the son he'd driven away decades ago. But what could a wild dog know about a father's deepest shame? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like a shroud, and Caleb Boone stood on his porch with a tin cup of coffee, watching the sun paint the peaks gold. His cabin sat nestled in a grove of towering pines, positioned just so that he could see anyone approaching from miles away, old habits from his cavalry days that had kept him alive through more scrapes than he cared to count. The structure itself was solid, built with his own hands from timber he'd felled and stones he'd hauled from the creek bed. Nothing fancy, but it kept the wind out and the warmth in. 23 years he'd been up here, and the routines had carved themselves into his bones like water-cutting stone. Coffee first, black as midnight. Then a walk around the property, checking the snares, noting what tracks had appeared overnight in the soft earth around his water source. The German shepherd had been there again. He could see the clear impression of its pads near the stream, cautious but deliberate. Caleb's weathered hands wrapped around the warm cup as his mind drifted to Sarah. She would have loved this place, though she never got the chance to see it. Hell, she'd probably have insisted on curtains for the windows and maybe some flowers planted around the front steps. The thought brought a familiar ache to his chest, the kind that had dulled over the years but never fully disappeared. He reached into his coat pocket and felt the smooth edges of the photograph he'd carried for 2 decades. Sarah and young Thomas on the porch of their house in Fort Benton, her arm around their boy's shoulders, both of them smiling at something just out of frame. Thomas couldn't have been more than 8 in that picture, gap-toothed and eager, looking up at his father with the kind of hero worship that made a man feel 10 feet tall. Those were different days. Back then, Caleb had worn the brass cavalry scout badge with pride, riding ahead of columns, reading the land like other men read books. He'd been good at his work, damn good, and the territory needed men who could navigate the wilderness and come back with intelligence that kept soldiers alive. Sarah had understood the importance of his service, even when it took him away for weeks at a time. The badge sat in his dresser drawer now, tarnished and forgotten, some symbols of honor aged better than others. Caleb set down his coffee and picked up his rifle, a well-maintained Winchester that had never failed him. Time for his morning circuit. The dog would probably show itself soon. It had developed a pattern over the past week, appearing when he began his daily rounds. Always at a distance, always watching. The forest was alive with the sounds of autumn, squirrels chattering in the branches, the distant hammering of a woodpecker, the whisper of wind through the needles. Caleb's boots made soft impressions in the carpet of fallen pine needles as he followed the familiar path toward his trapline. His movements were economical, purposeful, the result of decades spent in wild places where wasted motion could mean the difference between eating and going hungry. There, a flash of tan and black through the trees. The shepherd was keeping pace with him, maybe 50 yards out, moving like smoke through the undergrowth. Caleb had tried calling to it a few times, even left scraps of venison near where it liked to watch, but the animal maintained its careful distance. It wasn't afraid, exactly. More like it was waiting for something. The first trap held a rabbit, which Caleb dispatched quickly and cleanly before resetting the snare. The second was empty, though something had been at the bait. Likely that damn raccoon that had been plaguing him all summer. At the third trap he paused. The shepherd was closer now, maybe 30 yards away, sitting perfectly still among the ferns like it belonged there. "What do you want, boy?" Caleb said quietly. The dog's ears twitched, but it didn't move. "You're not starving, I can see that. And you're not lost." He studied the animal's posture, the alertness in its eyes. "So, what's your game?" The question hung in the air between them. Caleb had always been good at reading animals had to be, in his line of work. Spooked horses could alert hostiles to a scout's presence, and understanding the behavior of prey animals could mean the difference between a successful hunt and an empty belly. This dog wasn't exhibiting any of the usual behaviors he'd expect from a stray. No food-seeking desperation, no submission or dominance displays. Just that steady, patient watching. Memory stirred, unbidden and unwelcome, Thomas at age 12, begging for a dog of his own. "Every boy needs a dog, Pa," he'd argued with the earnestness that only children could muster. "Builds character." Caleb had been preparing for a long-range scouting mission and had brushed off the request with a promise to discuss it when he returned. By the time he came back 6 weeks later, Thomas had stopped asking. There were a lot of things Thomas had stopped asking about over the years. Caleb shook his head and continued his rounds. The past was finished business, and dwelling on it served no purpose beyond reopening old wounds. He'd learned that lesson the hard way. The morning progressed with its usual rhythm. Check the snares, scan for sign, note any changes in the forest's equilibrium. The dog followed, always maintaining that same careful distance. When Caleb stopped, it stopped. When he moved, it moved. Like a dance they'd been practicing for years instead of days. By the time he returned to the cabin, the sun was well up, and the mist had burned off, revealing the valley in all its autumn glory. The aspens on the far slopes had turned gold overnight, it seemed, and the air carried the crisp promise of winter. Soon enough, the first snows would come, and the high passes would close until spring. It was a lonely time of year, but Caleb had made peace with solitude long ago. He cleaned the rabbit on the chopping block beside his cabin, working with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd field-dressed more game than he could count. The shepherd had positioned itself at the edge of the clearing, watching his every movement. When Caleb tossed the entrails into the woods, the dog didn't even glance in their direction. "Definitely not hungry," he muttered to himself. The rest of the day followed its established pattern. Split wood for the coming winter, tend to his small vegetable garden, patch a section of roof where the wind had loosened some shingles. Simple tasks that kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering down paths better left untraveled. But the dog's presence changed something in the equation. For 23 years, this place had been his sanctuary, a refuge from memories and regrets. Now there was a witness to his solitude, a living reminder that the world beyond these mountains still existed. And with that reminder came the inevitable stirring of thoughts he'd worked hard to bury. Sarah's face, bright with laughter on their wedding day. Thomas taking his first steps across the parlor of their house in Fort Benton, arms outstretched toward his father. The pride in the boy's eyes when Caleb taught him to tie knots and track animals and read the weather in the clouds. And then the darkness that followed. Sarah's illness, swift and merciless, the way it hollowed her cheeks and dimmed her eyes until she looked like a stranger wearing his wife's face. Thomas, 16 and angry, lashing out at a world that had taken his mother and left him with a father who'd retreated into grief like a wounded animal retreating into a cave. The argument that ended everything had been about respect or duty or some other abstraction that seemed important at the time. Caleb couldn't even remember the specific words anymore. They'd been buried under 20 years of regret. But he remembered the look in Thomas's eyes when the boy finally gathered the courage to leave. Not anger, not disappointment, relief. That was the part that cut deepest. His son had been relieved to walk away from him. Evening brought its own rituals. a simple supper of fried rabbit and wild greens, eaten by lamplight at his rough-hewn table. Outside, the forest settled into its nighttime rhythms, and somewhere in the darkness, Caleb knew the shepherd was still watching, still waiting. He pulled the photograph from his pocket and set it beside his plate, studying Sarah's face in the flickering light. She'd been the glue that held their small family together, the one who'd smoothed over his rough edges and helped Thomas understand that his father's long absences weren't abandonment, but duty. Without her gentle influence, the house had become just a building, and the space between father and son had grown into an unbridgeable chasm. "What would you do, Sarah?" he asked the empty room. "What would you tell me about that dog out there?" But the photograph offered no answers, just the memory of a happiness that felt like something from another man's life. Caleb rose and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. He couldn't see the shepherd, but he knew it was there, patient and purposeful. Tomorrow would bring another day of watching and waiting, another day of questions without answers. He touched the tarnished cavalry badge in his dresser drawer before retiring, feeling its familiar weight. Once, that piece of brass had represented everything he valued: duty, honor, service to something greater than himself. Now it was just a relic from a time when the world had made more sense, when a man could define himself by the missions he completed and the lives he protected. Outside, the wind picked up, and somewhere in its voice, Caleb thought he heard an echo, choices unmade and words unspoken. The shepherd was out there in that wind, carrying its own mysterious purpose through the Montana darkness. And for the first time in 20 years, Caleb Boone fell asleep, wondering if the past was truly as buried as he'd believed. The 8th day changed everything. Caleb woke to the sound of scratching at his door, not the desperate clawing of an animal seeking shelter, but a deliberate, rhythmic pawing that spoke of intelligence and purpose. He rolled from his bunk and reached for his rifle before his mind fully caught up with his instincts. Through the window, he could see the German shepherd sitting on his porch, close enough that he could make out the details of its coat and the steady intelligence in its dark eyes. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, lowering the Winchester. In all his years in the wilderness, he'd never had a wild animal approach his cabin so boldly. The dog wasn't showing any signs of aggression. Its ears were up, but relaxed, its tail motionless but not tucked. It was waiting. Caleb dressed quickly and stepped onto the porch, moving slowly to avoid spooking the animal. The shepherd watched him, but didn't retreat. Up close, he could see it was a magnificent specimen, probably 3 or 4 years old, with the kind of muscle definition that spoke of a hard life in difficult country. Its coat was thick and well-maintained despite the wilderness living, and there were no obvious signs of injury or malnutrition. More telling was the collar-worn leather, dark with age and weather, but clearly crafted by human hands. No tags, no identifying marks, just a simple band that suggested this animal had once belonged to someone. The leather was old enough to have grown with the dog, which meant it had been wearing it for years. "Easy, boy," Caleb said softly, crouching down to the dog's level. "What's your story?" The shepherd tilted its head, studying him with an intensity that was almost unsettling. Then, without warning, it rose and trotted to the edge of the porch, looking back over its shoulder in a gesture so clearly communicative that Caleb felt a chill run down his spine. The message was unmistakable. Follow me. Every instinct told him this was foolish. Following an unknown animal into unfamiliar territory violated every rule of wilderness survival he'd learned in 4 decades of frontier life. But something in the dog's behavior suggested urgent purpose, and Caleb had learned to trust his intuition when it came to reading signs in the wild. He grabbed his pack, rifle, and enough supplies for a day's trek, then followed the shepherd into the forest. The dog led him away from his usual paths, heading northeast toward a section of the valley he'd rarely explored. The terrain grew rougher as they climbed, pine giving way to aspen and scrub oak, the ground rocky and uneven beneath their feet. The shepherd moved with the confidence of an animal that knew exactly where it was. pausing occasionally to ensure Caleb was keeping pace, but never wavering from its chosen route. After 2 hours of steady climbing, they crested a ridge and descended into a narrow valley Caleb had never seen before. The place had a different feel to it, quieter somehow, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Ancient pines towered overhead, their branches so thick they filtered the sunlight into cathedral-like shafts that danced with dust motes and pollen. The shepherd led him through this natural sanctuary to a clearing where the remains of a homestead sat like broken teeth among the undergrowth. Caleb stopped, feeling something cold settle in his stomach. The cabin had been substantial, once bigger than his own place, with a stone foundation and the remnants of what had been a well-built chimney. But time and weather had taken their toll. The roof had collapsed years ago, and the walls leaned at angles that defied gravity. What disturbed Caleb wasn't the ruin. Itself, the mountains were full of failed settlements, dreams abandoned when the reality of frontier life proved harsher than the dreamers had imagined. It was the evidence of recent habitation that made his hands shake as he approached the structure. Someone had been living here, and recently, a tarp had been stretched across one corner of the ruin, creating a crude but effective shelter. The remains of a fire ring sat nearby, the ashes cold but not yet scattered by wind and rain. And scattered around the makeshift camp were personal belongings that spoke of a long-term presence: a battered tin cup, a worn bedroll, clothing hung on makeshift lines between the trees. The shepherd sat at the edge of the clearing, watching him explore with the patience of a creature that had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Caleb's hands trembled as he picked up a shirt from the clothing line, flannel, well worn, sized for a man of average build. Nothing distinctive about it, nothing that would identify its owner. But something about the fabric, the way it had been mended at the elbow, stirred a memory he couldn't quite place. Near the fire ring, he found a tin plate and cup, both showing the kind of wear that came from years of use. Whoever had been camping here had settled in for the long haul, not just passing through. The arrangement spoke of someone comfortable in the wilderness, someone who knew how to make a temporary camp feel like home. It was when he moved deeper into the ruins that the cold in his stomach spread to his chest. Tucked beneath the collapsed roof beams, protected from the weather by the tarp, he found a small cache of personal items that made his breath catch in his throat. A wooden horse, carved from pine and worn smooth by countless hours of handling. The craftsmanship was crude but earnest, the kind of work a father might do to please a young son during long winter evenings. Caleb's vision blurred as he picked it up, his fingers finding the familiar grooves he'd carved 30 years ago in their house in Fort Benton. Beside the horse lay a pocket watch, its case tarnished and its face cracked. Caleb knew, without looking, that the hands would be stopped at 3:17, the exact time his world had fallen apart 20 years ago. The watch had been Thomas's gift to him for his birthday, saved up for with money earned doing odd jobs around the fort. "So you'll always know when to come home, Pa," the boy had said with the earnestness that only children could muster. Caleb had thrown the watch at the wall during their final argument, the sound of breaking glass, punctuating words that could never be taken back. He'd assumed it had been swept up and discarded with the rest of the debris from his shattered life. But here it was, carefully preserved by the son who had carried it into exile like a talisman of better times. The German shepherd appeared at his side, no longer maintaining its careful distance. It whined, softly, a sound that spoke of shared grief and understanding. Caleb's hands shook as he cradled the broken watch, feeling the weight of 20 years' worth of silence and stubborn pride. "Thomas," he whispered to the empty air. The name felt strange on his tongue after so many years of silence. "My boy." The dog pressed against his leg, offering the kind of comfort that only animals seemed capable of providing. And in that moment of contact, Caleb understood with terrible clarity why the shepherd had been watching him, why it had led him here. This wasn't a wild dog at all, it was a messenger, carrying news that a father needed to hear, but had been too proud to seek. Thomas had been here. His son had been living in this ruined place, carrying remnants of their shared past like sacred relics. But where was he now, and why had he left these precious items behind? The answers, Caleb realized with growing dread, lay somewhere ahead on whatever trail the shepherd would show him next. Because this wasn't the end of the journey, it was just the beginning of a reckoning 20 years in the making. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves overhead and carrying with it the scent of weather changing. Storm clouds were building over the peaks and the temperature was dropping. But Caleb barely noticed the approaching darkness. His attention was fixed on the broken watch in his hands and the terrible certainty that he was about to learn truths he wasn't prepared to face. The German shepherd waited patiently, ready to continue its mission of revelation. And for the first time in decades, Caleb Boone felt the crushing weight of a father's love and regret pressing down on him like the judgment of God himself. Caleb sat in the ruins of the homestead until the sun reached its zenith, turning the broken watch over and over in his weathered hands. The German shepherd had settled beside him, close enough that he could feel the animal's steady breathing, patient as stone. Around them, the forest carried on its eternal business, squirrels chattering in the branches, the distant cry of a hawk riding the thermals above the valley, but Caleb heard none of it. His world had narrowed to the weight of metal and memory in his palm. The wooden horse lay beside him on a flat stone, its carved features soft with age and handling. He remembered the winter he'd made it, Thomas barely 6 years old and fascinated by the cavalry horses that came and went from the fort. Sarah had been pregnant then, though they'd lost that baby before spring came. Dark days, but made bearable by Thomas's delight in the simple toy and the way Sarah's eyes would light up when she watched father and son playing together by the fire. "I carved this for you when you still believed your old man hung the moon," Caleb whispered to the empty air. His voice sounded strange after the long silence, rusty with disuse and thick with emotion. "Back when you'd sit on my lap and beg for stories about scouting missions and hostile encounters." The shepherd's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but the animal made no move to interrupt his reverie. Memory pulled him back to those early days when fatherhood had felt like the most natural thing in the world. Thomas had been an easy child, quick to laugh and eager to please, following Caleb around the fort like a devoted shadow whenever his father was home between missions. The boy had absorbed every lesson about tracking, hunting, and reading the signs of the wilderness with the hunger of someone born to the frontier life. "You were a natural," Caleb continued, his voice growing stronger. "Could read tracks better than some of the scouts I rode with. Had an eye for weather patterns that would have served you well in the territory service." He paused, throat tight with regret. "Would have served you well in a lot of things if I'd been half the father you deserved." The argument that had driven Thomas away came back to him now in painful detail, sharp-edged after 20 years of trying to forget. It had been about respect, about duty, about the kind of man Thomas was choosing to become. Sarah had been dead 6 months, and grief had turned both father and son into strangers occupying the same house. Thomas, 16 and raw, with his own pain, had been staying out late, running with boys who had no direction and less sense. Caleb, drowning in his own sorrow and guilt over Sarah's death, had tried to impose military discipline on a situation that called for understanding. "You're not a soldier," Thomas had shouted during their final confrontation. "You're my father, or you're supposed to be." The boy's voice had cracked on the words, revealing the hurt beneath his anger. "All you know how to do is give orders and disappear." "Well, I don't need orders anymore, and I sure don't need you." Caleb had responded with harsh words about responsibility and respect, about how Thomas needed to honor his mother's memory by becoming a man she could be proud of. But the real message, the one that cut deeper than any blade, had been simpler. "You're disappointing me. You're not the son I expected." He'd thrown the watch then, Sarah's birthday gift to him, watching it shatter against the wall like his relationship with his only child. Thomas had stared at the broken pieces for a long moment, then gathered them up with the careful reverence of someone collecting the fragments of his own heart. "I'll fix it," the boy had said quietly. "And when I do, maybe we can fix us too." But Thomas had left that night, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and the broken watch in his pocket. Caleb had been too proud to go after him, too certain that the boy would come home when hunger and hardship taught him the value of what he'd abandoned. Days became weeks, weeks became months, and still no word came. By the time Caleb's pride cracked enough to allow him to search, the trail had gone cold. Thomas had vanished into the vast expanse of the American frontier as completely as if the earth had swallowed him whole. "I should have come after you," Caleb whispered to the wooden horse. "Should have swallowed my pride and tracked you down like any other mission. But I told myself you'd come back when you were ready. Told myself you needed to learn some hard lessons about the world." His voice broke. "Truth was, I was scared. Scared that if I found you, you'd tell me to my face that you didn't want to come home." The German shepherd whined softly and moved closer, pressing against Caleb's leg with gentle insistence. The contact broke something loose in his chest, and for the first time in 20 years he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his loss. Not just Sarah's death, though that had been devastating enough, but the knowledge that he'd driven away the one person who might have helped him heal from it. He'd retreated to the mountains after that, building his cabin like a fortress against memory and regret. For 2 decades, he'd told himself that solitude was what he wanted, that the peace of the wilderness was compensation enough for the family he'd lost. But the dog's patient presence and the evidence of Thomas's recent habitation had stripped away those comfortable lies. Thomas had been here, in this forgotten valley, carrying relics of their shared past, like a man who'd never stopped hoping for reconciliation. The broken watch, carefully preserved despite its damage. The wooden horse, worn smooth by countless hours of handling. These weren't the belongings of someone who'd moved on from the past. They were treasures kept by a son who'd never stopped loving his father, despite everything that had passed between them. He kept them, Caleb said aloud, the wonder of it sharp in his voice. All these years, and he kept them. The implications hit him like a physical blow. If Thomas had been carrying these items, it meant he'd never really left. Not completely. Somewhere in his heart, the boy, now a man of 36, had been holding on to the hope that broken things could be mended, that father and son might find their way back to each other. But where was Thomas now? The camp showed signs of recent abandonment, but no indication of where its occupant had gone. The fire was cold, the clothing line empty, the shelter torn down with the methodical care of someone breaking camp for good. It felt like arriving at a train station just as the last engine pulled away, carrying with it the only passenger you'd ever wanted to see again. The shepherd rose and moved to the edge of the clearing, looking back with the same purposeful expression that had brought them here. The message was clear. This wasn't the end of the trail. There was more to discover, more truth to uncover, whether Caleb was ready for it or not. He gathered the wooden horse and the broken watch, tucking them carefully into his coat pockets where they settled against his heart like seeds of hope and terror. Whatever lay ahead, whatever the shepherd was leading him toward, he would follow. He owed Thomas that much, and more than he could ever repay. The wind was picking up, carrying the scent of weather changing. Storm clouds gathered over the peaks, and the temperature was dropping toward evening. But Caleb felt something warming in his chest for the first time in 20 years. Not peace, not absolution, but the terrible, necessary heat of love finally acknowledged and grief finally faced. His son had been here, and somehow, impossibly, that made all the difference in the world. The shepherd led him deeper into the abandoned homestead, past the main ruins to what had once been a root cellar carved into the hillside. The wooden door had long since rotted away, but the stone-lined entrance remained, dark as a mouth in the earth. The dog paused at the threshold, whining softly, before disappearing into the shadows below. Caleb followed, his boots scraping against stone steps worn smooth by decades of use. The cellar was larger than he'd expected, cool and dry despite the years of abandonment. Shafts of sunlight filtered through gaps in the overhead stonework, illuminating dust motes that danced like spirits in the stale air. What he found there made his blood run cold. More evidence of recent habitation, but different from the camp above. This had been a refuge, a place where someone had holed up for an extended period. Blankets were folded neatly in one corner, alongside a small cache of tinned goods and dried meat. A makeshift desk had been fashioned from an old wooden crate, and on it lay papers that made Caleb's hands shake as he reached for them. Military discharge papers, dated 18 months ago. The name at the top read, Thomas E. Boone, Staff Sergeant, United States Army. Caleb's vision blurred as he read the details: honorable discharge after 12 years of service, multiple commendations for valor, wounds sustained in action that had left him with a permanent limp and chronic pain. My God, Caleb whispered, you became a soldier after all. The papers told a story of distinguished service in a series of frontier conflicts, of a young man who'd followed his father's path into military life despite everything that had passed between them. Thomas had been wounded in a cavalry action against hostile Sioux, had spent months in a military hospital, and had been pensioned out with a modest disability payment that barely covered basic necessities. But it was the letter tucked beneath the discharge papers that truly broke Caleb's heart. Written in Thomas's careful hand, it was addressed to Pa and dated just 3 weeks ago. Asterisk, I don't know if you're still in the territory or even if you're still alive. Been tracking rumors and old stories for months, trying to find where you went after Fort Benton. Some trappers told me about a hermit up in the high country who matches your description, but I can't be sure. Part of me hopes it's not you, because that would mean you found the peace that always seemed to slip through your fingers when we were together. Asterisk, asterisk. I've been living rough since my discharge, trying to figure out what comes next for a broken-down cavalryman with no family and no prospects. The army was good to me, Pa. Taught me discipline, gave me purpose, helped me understand some of the lessons you tried to teach when I was too young and angry to listen. I rose through the ranks, made sergeant, led good men in hard fights. Think you might have been proud if you'd known. Asterisk. Asterisk. But I'm tired now. Tired in my bones and in my heart. The wounds I took at Little Crow Ridge don't heal proper anymore, and the doctors say they never will. Some days I can barely walk, and the pain is like nothing I've ever known. The pension barely keeps me fed, and I can't work steady enough to make a real living. Asterisk, asterisk. I've been thinking about Ma a lot lately, about how she used to say that family was the only thing that mattered in the end, the only thing that lasted when everything else fell apart. I was too proud to see it then, too angry to understand what I was throwing away when I walked out on you. But 20 years in the wilderness teaches a man some hard truths about what's important and what's just noise. Asterisk, asterisk. I'm going to try to find you, Pa. Don't know if you'll want to see me, given how we parted and the things I said. Don't know if I can even make the journey in my condition, but I need to try. Need to tell you that I'm sorry for the hurt I caused and that I never stopped carrying the memory of better days between us. Asterisk, asterisk. If you get this letter somehow, know that I understand now why you were the way you were. The weight you carried, the responsibility that kept you away so much, the grief that made you hard when Ma died. I carry the same weight now, and it's taught me that being a man means making peace with your regrets before they bury you alive. Asterisk, asterisk. I'll be heading up toward the high timberlands when the weather breaks, following old trapper routes and asking after hermit stories. If you're out there, I'll find you. And if I don't make it, well, at least I'll die trying to do the right thing for once. Asterisk, asterisk. Your son, Thomas Times. Caleb's hands trembled as he folded the letter. his vision blurred by tears he hadn't shed in decades. The German shepherd pressed against his leg, offering silent comfort as the full weight of understanding settled over him like a physical blow. Thomas had been coming home. His broken, wounded son had been making his way through the wilderness, carrying his pain and his hope in equal measure, trying to bridge the gap that pride and stubbornness had carved between them 20 years ago. The abandoned camp above wasn't evidence of someone living rough by choice. It was a way station, a place where an injured man had rested before attempting the final leg of a journey that might well have been beyond his physical capabilities. "How long ago?" Caleb asked the dog, though he knew the animal couldn't answer. "How long since he was here?" The evidence suggested weeks, maybe a month at the outside. The tinned goods were still fresh enough to be edible. The blankets showed no sign of mold or insect damage. Thomas had been here recently, very recently, and then he'd moved on toward Caleb's blood, turned to ice water as realization struck. The high timberlands. Thomas had been heading for the high country. The same brutal terrain where Caleb had built his hermit's refuge. But the route from this valley was treacherous even for a healthy man, full of hidden ravines and unstable rock faces that could cripple or kill the unwary. For someone with chronic injuries and limited mobility, it would be a death trap. "No," he whispered, rising to his feet with sudden urgency. "Not like this. Not when we were so close." The shepherd was already moving toward the cellar entrance, its body, language, radiating the same urgency that Caleb felt building in his chest. Time was running short, had been running short for weeks, while Caleb lived in ignorance just a few miles away, unaware that his son was struggling through the wilderness toward a reunion that might never come. He gathered Thomas's belongings with careful reverence, the discharge papers, the letter, a small bundle of personal effects that spoke of a life lived with purpose despite its hardships. His son had become a man of honor, had found his way to the same values that had once driven Caleb's own service to something greater than himself. But none of that would matter if Thomas had died in the high country, broken and alone, while his father sat in ignorant isolation just beyond the next ridge. The storm clouds were building overhead as they emerged from the cellar, and the wind carried the bite of early winter. Weather was changing, and changing fast. In the high timberlands, that could mean the difference between survival and death for a man traveling alone with limited supplies and chronic injuries. Caleb checked his rifle and shouldered his pack with the efficiency of long practice. The shepherd was already moving toward the tree line, heading northeast toward the high passes. There was no time to waste on regret or self-recrimination. His son was out there somewhere, possibly hurt, possibly dying, and for the first time in 20 years, Caleb Boone had a mission that mattered more than his own wounded pride. The race against time and weather had begun. The trail began as a whisper in the forest floor, scuffed pine needles, a partial boot print in soft earth, the kind of sign that only trained eyes could read. Caleb knelt beside a fallen log where someone had rested, running his fingers over the slight depression in the moss where a body had leaned for support. The impression was too deep, held too long. Thomas had been in considerable pain when he stopped here. The German shepherd waited patiently as Caleb studied the ground, cataloguing every detail with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through decades of dangerous country. The boot prints were irregular, favoring the right leg consistent with the limp mentioned in the medical discharge. More telling were the places where Thomas had used walking sticks carved from local deadfall and discarded when they became too worn to be useful. "Smart boy," Caleb murmured, recognizing his own lessons in the improvised walking aids. "Making do with what's available, conserving energy where you can." But the frequency of the rest stops told a different story, one of a man pushing himself beyond reasonable limits. They climbed steadily through the afternoon, following a route that showed Thomas's intimate knowledge of wilderness travel. The path avoided the obvious routes, the game trails and stream beds that would offer easier walking but also greater exposure to predators and sudden, weather changes. Instead, Thomas had chosen the harder way, following ridgelines and rocky ground that left minimal sign but offered better defensive positions and escape routes. It was the thinking of a cavalry soldier, trained in hostile territory, where careless movement could mean death. Caleb felt a complicated mix of pride and sorrow as he recognized the tactical wisdom in his son's route selection. The boy had learned his lessons well, perhaps too well for his own good. As they gained elevation, the evidence of Thomas's passage became more troubling. Blood on a granite outcropping where he'd struggled over a difficult section. A torn piece of fabric caught on a thorn bush, the cloth stained with what looked like dried blood. The boot prints became increasingly unsteady, and the rest stops more frequent. "He was hurting bad," Caleb said to the shepherd, his voice tight with worry. The dog's ears flicked toward him, but its attention remained focused on the trail ahead. Whatever the animal knew about Thomas's condition, it wasn't sharing through any means Caleb could understand. The terrain grew more treacherous as they climbed. Ancient avalanche paths had left behind fields of broken stone that shifted underfoot with every step. In several places, Caleb could see where Thomas had fallen, scraped rocks, disturbed scree, and in one heart-stopping instance, bloodstains on the sharp edge of a boulder that told of a serious injury. Near that spot, tucked under an overhanging rock, Caleb found the first of several items Thomas had discarded to lighten his load. A spare shirt, carefully folded but ultimately deemed non-essential. The fabric was good quality, military issue, but worn thin from long use and careful washing. Caleb held it to his nose and caught the faint scent of his son, wood smoke, leather, and something else that took him back 30 years to when Thomas was small enough to fall asleep in his father's arms. The afternoon light was beginning to fade when they reached the first major challenge, a steep ascent up a cliff face that would have been difficult for a healthy man, let alone someone dealing with chronic injuries. Caleb studied the rock wall, noting the handholds and the route Thomas had taken. Blood marked several of the holds, and at the base of the cliff lay a makeshift bandana, torn and stained dark red. Caleb's hands shook as he picked up the blood-stained cloth. It was Thomas's. He recognized the pattern from the cache at the abandoned homestead. But the amount of blood suggested a significant wound, something that would have weakened his son considerably and made the remaining climb even more dangerous. "God damn it, boy," Caleb whispered, his voice thick with anguish. "Why didn't you wait for help? Why didn't you send word somehow?" But even as he asked the questions, he knew the answers. Thomas had been too proud to ask for help, too uncertain of his reception to risk rejection. The apple hadn't fallen far from the tree in that regard. Both father and son had inherited the same stubborn independence that had served them well in some circumstances, but had become a fatal flaw when it came to their relationship with each other. The climb up the cliff face was brutally difficult even for Caleb, whose decades of mountain living had kept him in better condition than most men his age. The handholds were treacherous, the rock crumbling in places where weather had worked its patient destruction. More than once, he had to stop and work out a new route, when the obvious path proved too unstable to trust. The shepherd waited at the top, having found its own mysterious way up the cliff through routes known only to wild animals. When Caleb finally hauled himself over the edge, gasping and shaking from the effort, the dog was sitting patiently beside another piece of evidence, a small leather pouch that contained Thomas's military medals. Caleb's throat closed as he examined the decorations, a Medal of Valor for actions at Wolf Creek, a Purple Heart for wounds received in service to his country, campaign ribbons that told the story of a soldier who'd seen action across the frontier, who'd served with distinction in the same kind of dangerous, necessary work that had defined Caleb's own military career. "You were everything I hoped you'd become," he whispered to the gathering darkness, "and I wasn't there to see it." The medals had been carefully wrapped in oiled cloth to protect them from moisture, then secured in the leather pouch with the same attention to detail that Caleb had taught Thomas as a boy. Even in his extremity, Even while discarding weight to ease his climb, Thomas had taken care to preserve the symbols of his honor and service. The trail beyond the cliff became even more difficult to follow. The ground was mostly stone here, offering little purchase for boot prints, and the wind had picked up enough to scatter any loose debris that might have marked Thomas's passage. But the shepherd seemed to know the way, leading Caleb through a maze of broken terrain toward what looked like an impassable wall of granite rising into the darkening sky. As full darkness approached, Caleb was forced to make camp for the night. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the wind carried the smell of snow. Winter was coming to the high country, and with it the kind of weather that could kill a healthy man, let alone someone weakened by injury and exposure. He built a small fire in the shelter of a boulder field, using deadfall and pine needles to create enough warmth to keep hypothermia at bay. The German shepherd settled beside him, sharing its body heat in the way that only animals seem to understand was sometimes necessary for survival. "How long has he been out here?" Caleb asked the dog, though he knew the question was futile. "How long since he passed this way?" The wind moaned through the rocks like the voices of all the dead, soldiers who'd ever fallen in lonely places, far from home and family. Somewhere ahead in that wilderness, Thomas was fighting his own battle against time and weather and the limitations of a body that had given more to his country than it could afford to lose. Caleb fed the fire and settled in for what he knew would be a sleepless night, his rifle across his knees and his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new evidence of his son's struggle through this unforgiving country. And with each passing hour, the window for finding Thomas alive grew smaller and more desperate. The race against time had become a race against death itself. Dawn came grey and bitter, with the first flakes of snow dancing on the wind like harbingers of the storm to come. Caleb woke to find frost covering his bedroll, and the German shepherd pressed close against his side, sharing what warmth they could muster between them. The fire had died to cold ashes during the night, and darker, the temperature had dropped enough to turn his breath into visible clouds. He broke camp quickly, driven by the knowledge that every hour of delay might be the difference between finding Thomas alive or finding only another grave in the wilderness. The snow was falling more steadily now, fat flakes that clung to the rocks and pine needles with the persistence of winter asserting its dominance over the high country. The trail became increasingly treacherous as they climbed higher into the mountains. In several places, Caleb had to rope himself to secure anchors and belay across sections where a single misstep would mean a fatal fall into the rocky depths below. The shepherd found its own routes through the maze of stone and ice, appearing and disappearing like a spirit guide, leading him ever upward toward some unknown destination. It was near midday when they reached the tree line, emerging from the last stunted pines into a landscape of bare stone and endless sky. Here, the wind hit them with the full force of an early winter storm, driving snow horizontally across the exposed rock faces and making visibility nearly impossible. Caleb pulled his hat down and wrapped his coat tighter, but the cold still found its way through every gap in his clothing. The shepherd led him across a narrow saddle between two peaks, following what might once have been a game trail, but was now little more than a suggestion of easier passage through the brutal terrain. On the far side of the saddle, they began a steep descent into a valley that Caleb had never seen before, a hidden pocket of the high country that seemed untouched by human presence. That illusion lasted until they found Thomas's final camp. It was tucked into the shelter of a massive boulder that provided some protection from the wind, but the arrangement spoke of desperation rather than comfort. A tiny fire ring built from local stones, a lean-to shelter constructed from pine boughs, and a worn canvas tarp. Personal. Effects scattered around the area with the haphazard arrangement of someone too exhausted or injured to maintain proper camp discipline. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs as he approached the shelter, afraid of what he might find inside. But the lean-to was empty, except for a blood-stained bedroll and the lingering scent of sickness and pain. Thomas had been here, and recently, but he'd moved on, or been forced to move on by circumstances beyond his control. It was when Caleb began searching the abandoned camp that he found the item that broke his heart completely. Wrapped in a piece of oiled cloth and tucked carefully beneath a pile of pine needles, as if hidden for safekeeping, was Sarah's wedding ring. Caleb's hands trembled as he unwrapped the small golden band, worn thin by years of wear and polished smooth by loving touch. The last time he'd seen it, Sarah had been wearing it on her deathbed, her fingers grown so thin from illness that the ring threatened to slip away with every movement. After her death, he'd searched everywhere for it, assuming it had been lost in the chaos of her final days. Now he understood that Thomas had taken it, had carried it with him through 20 years of exile, like a talisman of the love that had once held their family together. "She's been with you all this time," Caleb whispered, clutching the ring against his chest. "Even when I drove you away, she was still with you." The implications hit him like a physical blow. Thomas had kept their mother's ring through everything: his angry departure from home, his years of military service, his wounds and discharge, and the difficult journey back toward a reconciliation that might never come. It was the most precious thing he owned, a connection to the woman who had loved them both unconditionally, and he'd been forced to abandon it here, in this desolate place. That meant Thomas was in desperate straits, worse off than Caleb had dared to imagine. No son would abandon his mother's wedding ring, unless he had no choice, unless survival itself demanded the sacrifice of everything that wasn't absolutely essential. The German shepherd whined softly and moved to the edge of the camp, where the rocky ground gave way to a steep slope leading down into what looked like an impassable maze of crevices and broken stone. But there, barely visible in the growing snowfall, Caleb could see the continuation of Thomas's trail. More blood on the rocks now, dark stains that spoke of serious injury and failing strength. The boot prints were erratic, stumbling, the gait of a man who was pushing himself beyond all reasonable limits. In one place, Caleb found where Thomas had fallen hard enough to leave an impression in the thin soil between the stones, and where he'd struggled for several minutes to regain his feet. "Why didn't you stop?" Caleb asked the wind and snow. "Why didn't you rest and wait for the storm to pass?" But he knew the answer even as he asked the question. Thomas had been dying, probably from his old wounds, aggravated by the brutal conditions and physical demands of the journey. He'd known he was dying, and he'd kept moving, because stopping meant giving up on the reunion that had driven him through the wilderness toward a father who might not even want to see him. The descent into the rocky maze tested every skill Caleb had learned in 40 years of dangerous country. The route was barely passable, even in good conditions, and the falling snow made every handhold treacherous and uncertain. More than once, he had to stop and work out alternate routes when the obvious path proved too unstable or too steep to manage safely. The shepherd moved through the terrain with supernatural grace, always staying just within sight, always leading him forward toward whatever destination it had in mind. The animal's patience and persistence reminded Caleb of Thomas himself, that same quiet determination, that same refusal to give up even when the odds seemed impossible. As the afternoon wore on and the snow continued to fall, the trail became increasingly difficult to follow. In several places, Thomas had clearly taken serious falls, leaving behind torn clothing and more blood on the unforgiving stone. Each piece of evidence told the story of a man who was literally dying on his feet, but who refused to stop moving toward the hope of reconciliation. Near what appeared to be the bottom of the rocky descent, Caleb found the most heartbreaking evidence yet of his son's condition. A crude walking stick, carved from local wood but abandoned when Thomas had become too weak to use it effectively. Beside it, scratched into a flat piece of sandstone with the point of a knife, were words that made Caleb sink to his knees in the snow. "P. tried to find you sorry for everything, your son Thomas." The message was unfinished, the letters growing weaker and more erratic toward the end, as if the effort of carving them had exhausted what little strength Thomas had left. But the intent was clear, achingly clear. Even in his extremity, even facing death alone in this desolate place, Thomas had been thinking of his father and the words that needed to be said between them. Caleb traced the carved letters with his finger, feeling the rough edges where the knife had scraped against stone. Somewhere ahead, through the falling snow and gathering darkness, his son was still moving, or had been, until the trail ended in whatever fate awaited broken men in the high country winter. The storm was intensifying, and visibility was dropping towards zero. Soon it would be impossible to follow any trail at all. But the German shepherd was still moving forward, still leading him deeper into the wilderness, toward whatever truth awaited at the end of this desperate journey. And Caleb followed, driven by love and regret and the terrible knowledge that he might be only hours away from finding his son's body frozen in the snow, carrying his father's unspoken forgiveness to whatever judgment awaited them all. The storm reached its fury as darkness fell, turning the world into a howling white void that erased landmarks and swallowed sound. Caleb pressed forward through snow that was now knee-deep, following the German shepherd more by instinct than sight. The dog seemed unaffected by the blizzard, moving with purpose through terrain that would have killed lesser creatures. When they finally stopped, it was at the mouth of what appeared to be a shallow cave carved into the granite cliff face. The shepherd disappeared into the darkness without hesitation, and Caleb followed, desperate for shelter from the killing wind. Inside, the blessed silence felt like absolution. After hours of nature's assault, Caleb struck a match, and the small flame revealed more than a simple cave. This was a prepared shelter, improved by human hands over time. The walls had been smoke-blackened by countless fires, and niches carved into the stone held supplies, dried food, blankets, even a small cache of firewood protected from moisture. Someone had used this place regularly, had turned it into a genuine refuge in the high country. But it was what the matchlight revealed in the deepest recess of the cave that stopped Caleb's breath entirely. A man sat against the back wall, wrapped in blankets, very much alive. "Thomas," Caleb whispered, the word torn from his throat like a prayer finally answered. The figure stirred, lifting a bearded face that bore the weathered lines of hard living, but unmistakably carried Sarah's gentle eyes and Caleb's own stubborn jaw. Thomas was thinner than Caleb remembered, marked by pain and privation, but he was breathing, conscious, and staring at his father with an expression of wonder and disbelief. "Pa?" Thomas's voice was hoarse, uncertain, as if he feared this might be a fever dream. "Is it really you?" Caleb moved toward his son like a man walking through water, every step requiring enormous effort. 20 years of separation compressed into a single moment of recognition, and neither man seemed to know how to bridge that gulf of time and hurt. "I got your letter," Caleb said, his voice breaking. "Found your camp, your belongings, thought you were—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Thomas tried to stand but winced and settled back against the stone. "Been here 3 days, maybe 4. Lost track of time when the fever got bad. Figured this would be the end of it, dying alone in a cave like some old hermit." He managed a weak smile. "Guess we've got that in common now." The German shepherd had settled between them, watching both men with patient intelligence. Thomas reached out to scratch behind its ears, and the animal leaned into the touch with obvious familiarity. "This is Rex," Thomas said, noting Caleb's attention. "My partner for the last 2 years. Lost his handler in our last action, and they were going to put him down," said he. "Was too aggressive for civilian life. But he wasn't aggressive, he was loyal, reminded me of someone I used to know." Caleb felt tears burning his eyes as understanding dawned. The dog hadn't been wild at all. Rex was a military working dog, trained for loyalty and purpose, who had somehow found his way to Caleb's cabin and recognized something in the older man that connected to his handler. The animal had been trying to bring them together, had succeeded where human pride and stubbornness had failed. "He knew," Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger. "Somehow Rex knew you were my father, Started acting strange about 6 months ago, leading me in directions I hadn't planned to go, refusing to settle anywhere for long. Finally gave up trying to fight him and decided to follow where he wanted to lead. Thomas looked directly at Caleb for the first time. Brought me to you, eventually. I'm sorry, Caleb said, the words inadequate but necessary. For everything. For the things. I said the way I drove you away. For not coming after you when my pride finally cracked. For 20 years of silence, when I should have been telling you every day that I loved you. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying his father's face in the flickering matchlight. I'm sorry too, he said finally. For the disrespect, for leaving the way I did, for not understanding until too late that grief makes men do things they don't mean. He paused, swallowing hard. Ma would have boxed both our ears for the way we've carried on. Despite everything, Caleb found himself laughing a sound so rusty and unfamiliar that it surprised them both. Your mother had strong opinions about foolish men and their stubborn ways, used to say we were too much alike for our own good. She was right, Thomas said, about most things. He fumbled in his coat and pulled out a familiar object, the broken pocket watch, its case dented but its face somehow miraculously restored. Fixed the movement, he said, offering it to his father. Took me 15 years to find the right parts, but I fixed it. Keeps perfect time now. Caleb took the watch with trembling hands, noting that the hands showed the correct time, despite everything the timepiece had been through. You carried this for 20 years? Carried a lot of things for 20 years, Thomas replied. Some were heavier than others. He reached into another pocket and pulled out the wooden horse, its carved surface polished to a warm glow. This, too. Kept thinking someday I might have a son of my own. Might want to tell him about the grandfather who taught me to read tracks and find my way by the stars. The emotion that washed over Caleb was so powerful he had to close his eyes against it. All those years of assuming his son had walked away and never looked back, when in reality Thomas had been carrying pieces of their shared past like sacred relics, hoping against hope that reconciliation might someday be possible. The brusque army was good to me, Thomas continued, gave me structure, purpose, a way to serve something bigger than my own hurt feelings. Made sergeant, led good men through bad situations. But I never stopped thinking about home, about the father who taught me everything I know about surviving in places like this. I should have come after you, Caleb said. Should have tracked you down within the first week and dragged you home by your ear, the way your mother would have wanted. We both made mistakes, Thomas replied, but we're here now. Rex made sure of that. He scratched the dog's ears again, and Rex thumped his tail against the stone floor. Question is, what do we do about it? Outside, the storm was beginning to subside, the howling wind dropping to a whisper. But inside the cave, father and son faced each other across 20 years of separation, each carrying wounds that might finally have a chance to heal. I've got a cabin, Caleb said. Not much, but it's warm and dry. Got room for a son who wants to come home, if that son can tolerate a stubborn old man who's forgotten how to live with other people. Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face into something that reminded Caleb powerfully of the boy who had once followed him around Fort Benton like an eager shadow. Think I'd like that, Thomas said. Think I'd like that very much. Rex stood and moved to the cave entrance, looking back at both men with the satisfaction of a job well done. The storm was passing, the way was clear, and the mission that had begun with patient watching outside a hermit's cabin was finally complete. The reconciliation that should have happened 20 years ago was finally within reach, brought about not by human wisdom or forgiveness, but by the faithful devotion of a dog who understood that some bonds are too important to let die, no matter how much pride stands in their way. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and silence. Caleb woke to find Thomas sitting by the entrance of the cave, staring out at the crystalline landscape with the quiet contemplation of a man who had expected never to see another Sunrise. Rex lay beside him, alert but peaceful, his mission complete but his vigilance unending. "Beautiful country," Thomas said without turning around. "Can see why you chose it for your exile." "Wasn't exile," Caleb replied, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Was just finding a place where the noise stopped." Thomas glanced at him with eyes that held too much understanding for a son to have about his father. "The noise doesn't stop, Pa. It just gets quieter for a while, lets you pretend you've made peace with things you haven't actually faced." The observation cut deep because it carried the weight of truth. Caleb had spent 23 years in these mountains, telling himself he'd found peace, when all he'd really found was distance from his pain. The guilt and regret had followed him into the wilderness like wolves, circling just outside the firelight, waiting for moments of weakness to close in. "Your mother used to say something similar," Caleb admitted. "Said running away from problems just gave them time to grow stronger in the dark." "Ma was a wise woman," Thomas said. "Took me 20 years to understand how wise." He stood slowly, favoring his right leg, and began gathering his few possessions. "We should head down while the weather holds. Storm like that will have buried any landmarks I might have remembered." But getting out of the high country would be more complicated than either man had anticipated. Thomas's condition was worse than he'd admitted. Caleb could see it in the careful way he moved, the lines of pain around his eyes, the shortness of breath that came from more than just the thin air at altitude. The wounds from his last cavalry action had been aggravated by the brutal journey through the mountains, and infection was setting in despite his efforts at field medicine. "How bad is it?" Caleb asked, noting the fever flush in his son's cheeks and the tremor in his hands. "Bad enough," Thomas replied with characteristic understatement, "but I've been hurt worse and lived to tell about it. Army doctors said the bullet fragments would work their way out eventually, but they seem to have taken a wrong turn somewhere along the way." Caleb examined his son's wound with the practical competence of a man who doctored bullet holes and arrow punctures in hostile territory. The injury was serious, infection spreading from old shrapnel that had shifted during the climb, creating internal bleeding and fever that could kill if left untreated. Thomas needed real medical attention, the kind that could only be found in a town with an actual doctor, not the rough field medicine Caleb could provide. "The nearest settlement is Copper Falls," Caleb said, mentally calculating distances and routes. 3 days. Down the mountain in good weather, maybe 5 in these conditions with the snow. He looked at his son's pallor and the way Thomas had to lean against the cave wall to stay upright. "Question is whether you can make it that far." "I made it this far," Thomas replied, with a ghost of his old stubbornness. "Won't quit now, when we're so close to getting out of this mess together." They broke camp with the methodical efficiency of men who'd spent their lives in places where careless haste could mean death. Thomas's military training had served him well. Despite his condition, he'd maintained proper equipment discipline, keeping his gear organized and his weapons clean even in extremity. Rex moved between them as they worked, offering silent encouragement and occasionally nudging Thomas when the young man paused too long or swayed on his feet. The descent began well enough. The storm had laid down a thick carpet of snow that made walking easier in some ways, cushioning the impact on Thomas's damaged leg and providing better traction on the steep sections. But it also concealed hazards, loose rocks, hidden crevices, patches of ice that could send an unwary traveler tumbling into space. Caleb took the lead, testing each step and calling back warnings about unstable ground or dangerous sections. Thomas followed at his own pace, with Rex staying close enough to provide support when the going got particularly difficult. The dog seemed to understand his handler's limitations, offering a shoulder to lean on during the steepest descents and positioning himself to break any potential falls. As they moved lower into the forest, Caleb found himself studying his son with new eyes, seeing not the angry teenager who had stormed out 20 years ago, but the man Thomas had become through hardship and service. The military bearing was unmistakable, The way he scanned their surroundings for threats, the economical use of energy, the quiet competence that marked professional, soldiers who'd seen real action. "Tell me about the war," Caleb said during one of their rest stops. "About the men you led, the actions you fought." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the distance with the expression Caleb had seen on the faces of too many veterans, men carrying memories that were simultaneously their greatest pride and their heaviest burden. "Good men," Thomas said finally, "better than they had any right to be, serving under a sergeant who was still learning how to lead. We did our job, kept each other alive most of the time, served with honor when honor was possible." He paused, unconsciously touching his wounded side. "Lost some along the way. That's the part that stays with you, not the victories or the commendations, but the faces of the boys who didn't make it home." Caleb nodded, understanding perfectly. He'd carried his own gallery of ghost faces for 40 years, men who'd trusted his scouting reports and navigation skills only to walk into ambushes or get caught in impossible situations where leadership meant choosing who lived and who died. "The burden of command," Caleb said. "Your mother never understood why I came back from missions quieter than when I left. Thought it was just the solitude, the long weeks alone in hostile country. But it wasn't the alone time that wore on me, it was the weight of knowing that my mistakes could get good men killed." "That's why you were so hard on me," Thomas said, "and it wasn't a question. You were trying to prepare me for that weight, make sure I was strong enough to carry it if the time came." "Probably," Caleb admitted. "Though I went about it all wrong, treated you like a recruit instead of a son who was grieving his mother." He looked directly at Thomas for the first time since they'd started talking. "I was so afraid of losing you too that I ended up driving you away. Seems like a special kind of foolishness now." The afternoon brought new challenges as they descended into the middle elevations where the snow gave way to rain and the footing became treacherous with mud and fallen leaves. Thomas's condition was deteriorating, his fever was rising, and he was having increasing difficulty maintaining his balance on the slippery terrain. "We need to find shelter," Caleb said, as the rain intensified. "Get you warm and dry, let that fever break before we push any further." "Can't stop now," Thomas protested, though his voice carried the weakness of a man fighting on pure determination. "Weather might turn worse, trap us for days." "Better trapped alive than dead on the trail," Caleb replied, with the authority of command. "We find shelter, we rest, we keep you breathing. Everything else is secondary." Rex seemed to agree with this assessment, ranging ahead and barking once from somewhere in the trees. When they followed the sound, they found the dog standing beside the ruins of an old hunter's cabin, its roof intact enough to provide real shelter from the rain. Inside, they built a fire and made Thomas as comfortable as possible with the blankets from his pack. But even as they settled in for what might be a long wait for better weather, Caleb could see that his son was losing the fight against infection and exhaustion. The fever was climbing, and Thomas was beginning to show the disconnected behavior that meant his body was shutting down non-essential systems to focus on survival. "Tell me about the cabin," Thomas said, his voice growing weaker. "Your place in the high country. What's it like living alone up there for 20 years? Caleb found himself describing his hermit's refuge in more detail than he'd ever shared with anyone. The morning routines, the seasonal changes, the way silence could become a companion if you learned to listen to it properly. But even as he talked, he was calculating travel times and medical options, trying to determine whether they could reach Copper Falls before Thomas's condition became critical. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and somewhere in its steady rhythm, Caleb thought he could hear the sound of time running out. They'd found each other again after 2 decades of separation, but the reunion might be tragically brief if they couldn't get Thomas the medical attention he needed. Rex lay between them, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight as he watched both men with the patient devotion that had brought them together. The dog's mission was complete, but his vigil was far from over. In the morning, they would face the most dangerous part of their journey, Not the physical challenges of the mountain terrain, but the race against time and Thomas's failing health. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up through the broken chimney into the dark sky above, and Caleb settled in for another sleepless night of watching over his son, praying to whatever forces had preserved them this long to see them safely through one more trial. Dawn brought no relief from the rain, but Thomas's fever had broken during the night, leaving him weak but lucid. Caleb had maintained the fire through the long hours of darkness, watching his son's face for signs of crisis, while Rex kept patient vigil between them. The dog seemed to sense the urgency of their situation, rising and moving to the cabin entrance as soon as the first grey light filtered through the broken roof. "We have to move," Caleb said, helping Thomas sit up. "Rain's not stopping, and you need a real doctor before that infection comes back worse." Thomas nodded, though the effort of sitting upright clearly cost him. The colour had returned to his face, but his movements were careful and deliberate, the actions of a man conserving what little strength remained. "How far to Copper Falls?" 2 days, maybe 3 in this weather. Caleb studied his son's condition with the practiced eye of someone who'd assessed wounded men in hostile territory. "Can you make it?" "Have to," Thomas replied simply, not dying in a broken-down cabin after coming this far. They gathered their gear with silent efficiency, each man understanding that every minute counted now. The rain had turned the forest floor into a treacherous mix of mud and fallen leaves that concealed roots and rocks capable of breaking bones. Thomas would need help navigating the worst sections, but his pride made asking for assistance difficult, another trait he'd inherited from his father. Rex took point as they left the cabin, ranging ahead to scout the safest routes through the increasingly difficult terrain. The dog's intelligence was remarkable, finding game trails and dry passages that human eyes might have missed, doubling back to guide them around the worst obstacles. "Smart animal," Caleb observed as Rex led them around a washout that would have cost them precious hours to navigate. "Smarter than his handler most of the time," Thomas agreed, managing a weak smile. "Kept me alive through liquor. Situations where common sense would have gotten me killed." The morning progressed with grinding difficulty. Every step was a negotiation with terrain that seemed actively hostile to their passage. Thomas's strength faded steadily despite his efforts to hide it, and by midday he was leaning heavily on the walking stick Caleb had cut from a sturdy pine branch. It was Rex who first detected the sound of running water ahead, not the gentle babble of a mountain stream, but the roar of a river in full flood. They emerged from the trees to find their route blocked by Widow Creek, normally a shallow waterway easily forded, now transformed into a raging torrent by the overnight rain and mountain runoff. Caleb stared at the rushing water with growing desperation. The creek was maybe 30 feet across, but the current was powerful enough to sweep away horses, let alone men weakened by injury and exhaustion. The nearest bridge was 5 miles upstream, a detour that would add at least a day to their journey and might well prove fatal to Thomas in his current condition. "There," Thomas said, pointing upstream to where a massive pine had fallen across the narrowest section of the creek. The trunk was thick enough to support their weight, but the bark was slick with rain and spray from the rushing water below. "Too dangerous," Caleb said immediately. "You're in no condition to cross something that narrow in these conditions." "No choice," Thomas replied, with quiet determination. "I'm not getting any stronger, and that water's not getting any lower. If we're going to do this, it has to be now." Caleb studied the makeshift bridge with the eye of a man who'd made similar life-or-death decisions in hostile territory. The crossing was possible, but barely, and any slip would mean death in the churning water below. But Thomas was right about their options. The detour would almost certainly be fatal, while the direct crossing offered at least a chance of survival. "I go first," Caleb decided. "Test the footing, set up a safety line. You follow when I signal, and Rex comes last." "Pa," Thomas said, catching his father's arm, "if something happens, nothing's going to happen." Caleb interrupted firmly. "We've come too far to lose each other now." The crossing began, with Caleb inching his way along the rain-slick log, testing each foothold and handhold before committing his full weight. The roar of the water below was deafening, and spray from the rapids soaked him within seconds. Halfway across, his boots slipped on the wet bark, and for a heart-stopping moment he dangled over the rushing torrent before managing to haul himself back onto the log. "Careful!" Thomas shouted over the noise, his voice tight with fear for his father's safety. Caleb reached the far side after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, then immediately began setting up a safety rope system using his belt and Thomas's rifle sling. The improvised line wouldn't stop a fall, but it might provide enough support to prevent a slip from becoming fatal. "Your turn," Caleb called back. "Take it slow, trust the rope, and don't look down at the water." Thomas began his crossing with the careful precision of a man who understood that this moment would determine whether he lived or died, whether the reunion with his father would last days or decades. Thomas moved across the fallen log with the deliberate care of a man who knew his limitations. Each step was calculated, each shift of weight tested before commitment. The safety rope stretched between his hands provided psychological comfort more than actual security. But Caleb maintained steady tension on it, ready to arrest any fall that might occur. Halfway across, disaster struck. Thomas's damaged leg buckled without warning, the old injury aggravated by days of mountain travel finally betraying him at the worst possible moment. He dropped to his knees on the slick log, arms windmilling for balance as his body swayed toward the rushing water below. "Hold on!" Caleb shouted, throwing his full weight against the safety rope. The improvised line snapped taut, arresting Thomas's fall, but leaving him dangling precariously over the torrent with only his grip on the wet bark, keeping him from plunging into the rapids. Rex barked frantically from the far side, pacing back and forth as he watched his handler struggle for survival. The dog's distress was palpable, but there was nothing the animal could do except bear witness to the crisis unfolding above the roaring water. "Can you pull yourself up?" Caleb called, his voice barely audible over the noise of the creek. Thomas strained against his own weight, muscles trembling with exhaustion and the effects of his infection. For a moment it seemed he might succeed, his military training and determination overcoming physical limitations. But the wet bark provided no purchase for his boots, and his weakened condition made even this basic movement impossible. "Can't," Thomas gasped, his face pale with effort. "Arms are going." Caleb felt panic rise in his throat as he realized his son was about to fall. 20 years of separation, a miraculous reunion, and now this death by drowning while his father watched helplessly from 30 feet away. The cruel irony of it threatened to break his heart completely. But then training took over, the old cavalry scout's instincts that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations. Without hesitation, Caleb tied off the safety rope and began working his way back onto the log, moving toward Thomas with the controlled urgency of a man who'd made similar rescues in hostile territory. "Hold on," he called to his son. "I'm coming." The log was even more treacherous going back, slick with spray and trembling under the weight of 2 men. But Caleb had spent 40 years navigating dangerous terrain, and muscle memory guided his movements even when conscious thought might have paralyzed him with fear for Thomas's life. He reached his son just as Thomas's grip began to fail completely. Without ceremony, Caleb grabbed Thomas's coat collar and hauled him back onto the log, both men gasping with the effort and the terror of how close they'd come to losing each other again. "Easy," Caleb said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Get your breath. We'll do this together." What followed was the longest journey of both men's lives, 30 feet of rain-slick wood over rushing water, with Thomas leaning heavily on his father for support and guidance. They moved as one organism, each step coordinated and careful, neither man daring to think beyond the next foothold. Rex whined encouragement from the safety of solid ground, his tail wagging frantically as he watched their progress. The dog seemed to understand that his humans were in mortal danger, and his anxiety was a tangible presence in the air around them. Step by careful step, they approached the far bank. Caleb could feel Thomas's strength failing with each movement, could sense his son's body fighting to remain conscious despite the demands being placed on it. But they were so close now, close enough that Rex could almost reach them from the shore. The final few feet were covered in a rush of desperate energy as both men realized salvation was within reach. They stumbled off the log onto solid ground, collapsing in a tangle of limbs and equipment as the adrenaline that had sustained them through the crossing finally gave way to exhaustion. "We did it," Thomas gasped, his face pressed against the muddy earth as if he couldn't believe they'd survived. "We actually did it." Rex was on them immediately, licking faces and whining with relief, his tail beating the ground like a drum as he celebrated their survival. For several minutes, the three of them simply lay there in the rain, too overwhelmed by what they'd endured to do anything but breathe. But eventually, reality intruded. Thomas needed medical attention, and they were still more than a day from Copper Falls. The crossing had cost them precious time and energy, and Thomas's condition had deteriorated further during the ordeal. "Can you walk?" Caleb asked gently. Thomas struggled to his feet with visible effort, swaying slightly but maintaining his balance. "For now," he said simply, "but we better move fast. I don't have much left in reserve." They gathered their scattered equipment and set off down the mountain, following Rex as the dog resumed his role as guide and guardian. Behind them, Widow Creek continued its relentless roar, indifferent to the human drama that had just played out above its waters. The hardest part of their journey was behind them, but the race against time and Thomas's failing health was far from over. 3 months later, Caleb stood on the porch of his mountain cabin, watching Rex chase snowflakes in the clearing as winter settled over the high country. The dog had adapted well to domestic life, though he still maintained the vigilant alertness of a soldier on guard duty. Some habits, Caleb reflected, were too deeply ingrained to change completely. Inside the cabin, Thomas was recovering slowly but steadily from the surgery that had saved his life. The doctor in Copper Falls had been grim about his chances when they'd finally staggered into town that rain-soaked evening, Thomas barely conscious and burning with fever. But military surgeons had apparently built him tough, and the infection that should have killed him had yielded to proper medical treatment and his father's constant care. The reunion that had begun in a mountain cave was continuing in the quiet rhythms of shared domestic life. They'd discovered that 20 years of separation hadn't erased their fundamental compatibility. Both men valued silence when it was called for, understood the importance of routine and preparation, and found comfort in the kind of purposeful work that kept hands busy and minds focused on practical matters. Thomas emerged from the cabin now, moving with the careful gait of a man whose body had been through more than its fair share of trauma, but who was determined not to let physical limitations define his life. He'd put on weight since leaving the hospital, and the hollow look had faded from his eyes, replaced by something that might eventually become contentment. "Mail came through," Thomas said, holding up a letter with official markings. "Army Pension Office finally tracked me down. Seems they owe me more back pay than I thought." Caleb nodded, pleased but not surprised. His son had always been meticulous about such things, even as a boy. Enough to make a difference, enough to buy some lumber, maybe improve this place a bit. Add a proper second room, fix the roof before next winter. Thomas paused, studying his father's expression. "Assuming you don't mind a permanent house guest." The question carried weight beyond its simple words. In the months since Thomas's return, they'd been feeling their way carefully around the shape of their renewed relationship, both men aware that good intentions couldn't erase 20 years of separate living in a matter of weeks. But the careful politeness of the early days had gradually given way to something more natural, more genuine. "Cabin's been too quiet for too long," Caleb replied. "Besides, Rex has decided he belongs here. Wouldn't want to disappoint him." Thomas laughed, the sound carrying none of the bitterness that had marked their reunion in the cave. "Rex knows a good thing when he sees it. Smart dog." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the snow fall on the valley below. The peace between them was real, but it was also fragile, built on the foundation of shared trauma and the knowledge that they'd almost lost each other forever. Both men understood that healing would be a long process, that trust would have to be rebuilt slowly and carefully. "Been thinking about Ma lately," Thomas said quietly, "about what she'd say if she could see us now." Caleb touched his pocket, where Sarah's wedding ring rested alongside the photograph he'd carried for 2 decades. Thomas had insisted he keep the ring, saying it belonged with the man who'd loved her first and longest. She'd probably say it was about time we came to our senses. Probably remind us that family forgives, no matter how much foolishness gets in the way. Thomas agreed. She was good at cutting through the noise, getting to what mattered. Rex bounded up onto the porch, shaking snow from his coat and settling between them with the satisfaction of a dog who'd accomplished his mission and found his permanent place in the world. His presence was a constant reminder of the mysterious ways that loyalty and love could bridge even the widest gaps. "What do you miss most?" Caleb asked. "About the army, about the life you had before." Thomas considered the question seriously. "The purpose, maybe. Knowing that what you did mattered, that good men depended on you to make the right decisions." He paused. "But I'm finding there are different kinds of purpose. Taking care of this place, helping you prepare for winter, even just being here when you need someone to talk to, that matters too." "Your mother would be proud," Caleb said simply, "of the man you became, the service you gave, the way you found your way home despite everything that stood in the way." As evening approached, they moved inside to the warmth of the cabin. Thomas had taken over most of the cooking duties, discovering that army field experience translated well to frontier domestic life. Rex settled by the fire, content to watch his humans go about the business of living together in peace. Over dinner, they made plans for the spring improvements to the cabin, expansion of the garden, possibly some hunting and trapping that would provide both sustenance and modest income. Simple plans, but they represented something neither man had possessed for too long, a shared future built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Later, as Thomas settled into his bunk and Caleb banked the fire for the night, both men understood that they'd been given something precious, a second chance that many fathers and sons never receive. The years of separation couldn't be undone, and the scars of their old conflicts would always remain. But they were together now, and that made all the difference. Outside, the wind sang through the pines with the voice of winter settling over the mountains. But inside the cabin, 3 souls who'd found their way home despite all the odds against them rested in the warmth of forgiveness and the knowledge that some bonds are strong enough to survive, even the worst that pride and stubborn hearts can do to damage them. The German shepherd's mission was complete, but his vigil would continue for as long as his humans needed him. And, in the quiet darkness, Caleb Boone fell asleep to the sound of his son's steady breathing and the contented sigh of a dog who'd brought his broken family back together against all hope and expectation.